The stars burned cold and distant beyond the reinforced glass of Colony Nova's command deck. General Elias Vance stood motionless, watching the vast alien fleet materialize from the void. The incoming warships formed an unbroken wall of death, their dark hulls illuminated only by the crimson glow of their thrusters. For 10 years, humanity had evaded total annihilation, but this was the end. Behind him, the command center was alive with frantic energy. Officers barked orders, engineers recalibrated the planetary shields, and defense teams armed the colony's last functioning railguns. Vance took a slow breath. The last human colony, the last ember of his species, stood on the brink of extinction. "Sir, incoming transmission from the enemy flagship," Lieutenant Sarah Maddox reported, her voice barely hiding her tension. Vance turned, nodding once. "Put it through." The holoscreen flickered to life, revealing the monstrous face of an Ulmer warlord. His reptilian features were contorted in what might have been satisfaction, his emerald eyes gleaming. "Humans," the warlord sneered. "Your struggle ends today. You will surrender, or you will perish." Vance folded his arms. "That's what you said the last 3 times. The Ulmer's eyes darkened. "This time, we are not alone." The screen shifted, showing a disturbing image, one of the Ulmer's own ships, drifting lifelessly in space. The hull was scarred, but not by weapons. Something had torn through it from within. Then, movement. A shape slithered through the shadows, something grotesque, no longer Ulmer, no longer anything recognizable. Vance's stomach twisted. "What the hell is that?" The warlord's expression tightened. "Our greatest mistake. And soon, yours as well." Before Vance could respond, alarms blared across the command center. The colony's long-range scanners pulsed red with warning signs. Maddox's fingers flew across the console, her face paling. "Sir." "We have," she stopped, her voice catching. "We have movement inside the colony." Vance froze. That wasn't possible. Their defenses were impenetrable. No ship had landed. No breach had been detected. And yet, a new image filled the holoscreen. Security footage from Subsector 3C, one of the colony's outer residential zones. The camera feed flickered, distorted by static, but the scene was unmistakable. A human, one of their own, stood in the center of a blood-smeared corridor, trembling violently. His skin had turned a sickly gray, his veins pulsing with black fluid. His mouth gaped open, but no breath came. Then, he moved, jerky, unnatural. His head twisted toward the camera, eyes hollow and leaking black ichor. "Oh, God," Maddox whispered. The infected man lunged forward. A second figure appeared behind him, then a third. More bodies shambled into view, each twisted by the same horror. Then, without warning, they accelerated, moving with terrifying speed, clawing at the walls, at the air, at each other. A piercing shriek cut through the footage. The camera feed died. Vance exhaled sharply. "Quarantine that sector. Now." Maddox hesitated. "Sir, we don't." "Now, Lieutenant." She jumped into action, sealing the blast doors of Subsector 3C. But they all knew it was too late. The infection had already spread. The Ulmer warlord's voice crackled back through the speakers. "You understand now, don't you, General? There will be no war. No conquest. Only the infection. It consumes all." Vance clenched his fists. "Then why did you come?" The warlord let out something between a growl and a sigh. "Because we had nowhere else to run." At that moment, the first explosion rocked the colony. The infected had reached the power conduits. The lights flickered, and the screams began. Vance turned to his officers. "Get every remaining soldier armed. We are not dying today." Maddox looked at him. "Sir, if that infection spreads, then we burn everything that stands in its way." Alarms howled through the steel corridors of Colony Nova, drowning out the distant screams. Red emergency lights pulsed in rhythmic warning as the infection spread like wildfire through Subsector 3C. General Elias Vance stormed through the command deck, his mind racing. He had fought countless battles, survived sieges, outmaneuvered entire alien fleets, but he had never faced an enemy like this. This wasn't war. This was a disease, a horror beyond tactics and strategy. "Status," he barked. Lieutenant Sarah Maddox's fingers flew across the control panel. "Containment teams are moving in, but they're reporting hostiles in the dozens." "No, hundreds." Vance stiffened. "Hundreds? That's impossible. We only had 20 confirmed infections." Maddox swallowed hard. "Sir, whatever this is, it spreads faster than anything we've ever seen." On the main holoscreen, a live feed from the colony's security cameras flickered in and out. The footage showed soldiers in black combat armor advancing through the corridors, rifles raised. The moment they rounded a corner, they froze. Something moved in the shadows. A mass of bodies, no longer human, convulsing and shifting unnaturally. The infected turned in eerie unison, their hollow eyes locking onto the fresh prey. Then, they charged. The soldiers opened fire, their weapons ripping through rotting flesh. But the undead didn't stop. They moved too fast, closing the distance in seconds. Clawed hands and gaping maws overwhelmed the front line. One soldier screamed as he was dragged into the swarm, his armor cracking under impossible force. Another fired point-blank into the skull of a former comrade, only for the corpse to grab him by the throat and tear into his flesh with unnatural strength. The screen cut to static. A cold weight settled in Vance's gut. "They're not just fast," he murmured. "They're evolving." The Ulnar warlord's transmission remained open, his scaled face grim. "Now you see," he said. "Your weapons won't save you." "They didn't save us." Vance turned sharply toward him. "You knew about this before you came here." The warlord nodded, his reptilian features darkening. "It started with a single ship. A research vessel, investigating a derelict world. The virus was dormant, until it wasn't. One by one, they turned. It didn't just kill them. It remade them." Maddox's voice shook. "And you still brought it here?" The Ulmer narrowed his emerald eyes. "We had no choice. Our empire is gone. Every planet we ran to fell within days. We are the last of our kind." He leaned closer to the screen. "Now you are the last of yours." Vance clenched his jaw. There was no time for blame. The colony was falling apart. "We need a solution. Now." Maddox hesitated. "Sir, if this thing is spreading as fast as we think," she looked up, her face pale. "The colony is already lost." Vance stared at the display. Subsector 3C was gone. The infection had reached the central atrium. Thousands lived there. Civilians. Families. He had ordered planets burned to stop invasions before. Could he do the same to his own people? He exhaled. Evacuation protocol. Get every survivor to the upper sectors. Lock down everything else. Maddox nodded grimly. Understood. Vance turned back to the Ulmer. "Your fleet. What's left of it?" The warlord's gaze hardened. "Less than half our ships remain uninfected. Our command vessel is compromised. We have nowhere to go." Vance's mind raced. "We still have a chance. If we can reach the Exodus docks, we can escape to deep space." Maddox's head snapped up. "Sir, you're suggesting abandoning Colony Nova?" He met her gaze. "If we stay, we die." Before she could answer, a deafening explosion rocked the station. The force knocked Vance off his feet. Overhead lights flickered as power conduits ruptured. "Breach in the central atrium." Maddox shouted. "They're coming up." The command center doors burst open. A figure lurched inside. A human, at least, it had been. Its jaw hung loose, its skin stretched thin over blackened veins. Maddox instinctively raised her sidearm, firing a shot into its skull. The body hit the ground, twitching. Then, a guttural shriek echoed through the halls. Dozens more appeared. Some were former soldiers, their armor torn and bloodied. Others were civilians, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. They moved unnaturally fast, pouring into the room with inhuman hunger. Vance grabbed his rifle and fired, cutting down the first wave. Fall back. Maddox emptied her clip, barely slowing the tide. There's too many. Vance's heart pounded. He glanced at the emergency lockdown switch near the entrance. A last resort failsafe. If activated, it would seal off the command deck, trapping them inside but buying the evacuees time. Get to the upper levels, he roared. I'll hold the line. Maddox's eyes widened. Sir, you can't. That's an order. She hesitated, then clenched her jaw. We'll see you on the other side. As she and the remaining officers fled, Vance slammed the lockdown switch. The reinforced doors sealed shut with a heavy clang. He turned to face the horde. They came like a wave, shrieking and ravenous. He raised his rifle. Outside, the colony burned. The last of the blast doors sealed shut behind Lieutenant Sarah Maddox, cutting off the screams and gunfire from the command center. She hesitated, heart pounding, staring at the reinforced steel. General Vance was still in there. Alone. Keep moving, a voice barked. She snapped out of it. Sergeant Darius Cole, one of the last surviving security officers, shoved past with a handful of evacuees, engineers, medics, civilians. All terrified. All running for their lives. Maddox turned and sprinted with them, gripping her pulse rifle so tightly her knuckles ached. The colony was collapsing. The infection was spreading faster than they could contain it, and the only way out now was the Exodus docks, if they could make it in time. We're approaching the junction. Cole shouted over the chaos. Maddox pulled up her wrist display and checked the colony schematics. The nearest transit line was ahead, but... Shit, she cursed. The display pulsed red. The monorail system is down. We'll have to go on foot. Cole swore under his breath. That'll take too long. A deafening crash made them both whirl around. A bulkhead further down the corridor buckled inward, then exploded apart. The infected poured through like a flood, their hollow, black-veined faces twisted in an unnatural hunger. No time to argue. Move! Maddox yelled. They ran. The colony's once pristine halls were now a war zone. Dead bodies littered the floors, some half-eaten, others twitching with the virus's corruption. The overhead lights flickered, casting eerie shadows. The deeper they went, the more the walls themselves seemed wrong. Pulsing. Mutating. The infection was spreading beyond flesh, it was rewriting the station itself. Almost there. Cole shouted. Ahead, the airlock to the Exodus docks loomed like salvation. But between them and escape. More infected. This time, they weren't just humans. A monstrous figure stood at the center of the horde, twice the size of a man, its body a grotesque fusion of human and alien flesh. Ulmer. One of the reptilian warlords. Or at least, it had been. Now, its scaled flesh was rotting, its limbs elongated, its jaws splitting unnaturally wide. It locked its sickly green eyes onto Maddox and let out an unearthly screech. Then, it charged. Take it down! Maddox screamed. The soldiers unloaded their weapons. Pulse rounds and plasma bolts ripped through the infected, but the Ulmer monstrosity barely slowed. It crashed through its own kind, barreling toward them with terrifying speed. Cole fired a grenade. The explosion tore apart the corridor, sending bodies flying. When the smoke cleared, the massive infected still stood, burning, but alive. It lunged. Maddox barely dodged as it crashed into the ground where she had been standing, the force of the impact denting the metal floor. She spun, raised her rifle, and fired point-blank into its head. Nothing. The thing roared, swiping at her with claws sharp enough to carve through steel. A sudden explosion rocked the corridor. Maddox was thrown backward, slamming into the wall. Dazed, she looked up and saw the Ulnar warlord from the transmission standing over the burning corpse of its mutated kin. The alien warlord's plasma cannon still smoked from the shot. His emerald eyes swept over the humans with something between disdain and grim acknowledgement. "You fight well," he rumbled. Cole raised his weapon. "Like hell we're trusting you. Stand down." Maddox barked, pushing herself to her feet. She locked eyes with the warlord. "You knew this would happen," she accused. "And yet you're here, saving us. Why?" The Ulnar warrior bared his fangs. "Because your species is stubborn." He gestured toward the hallway, where more infected Ulnar writhed and twitched in grotesque transformation. "Our kind was doomed the moment the first infection took hold. We fought. We burned entire fleets. We lost." He turned his piercing gaze on her. "But you? You are different. Your kind does not surrender easily. That is why I am here." Maddox exhaled. They didn't have time for hesitation. The colony was falling, and they needed every advantage they could get. She extended a hand. "Then we worked together." The warlord's lip curled in what might have been amusement, or respect. He took her hand. "I am War Chief Sal Zyr of the Ulnar Dominion." "Maddox." "Lieutenant Maddox." Sal Zyr nodded, then gestured toward the airlock. "Then we must leave. Now." Maddox turned to Cole and the rest of the survivors. "You heard him. Move out." As they rushed toward the airlock, Maddox cast one last glance toward the burning corridors of Colony Nova. Vance was gone. The colony was doomed. But humanity? Not yet. The Exodus docks were a graveyard. The massive hangar, once a bustling hub for interstellar transport, was now a battlefield of twisted steel and charred bodies. Half-destroyed ships littered the docking bays, their hulls scarred with plasma burns and claw marks. Flickering emergency lights bathed everything in a sickly red glow, making it impossible to tell where the blood ended and the metal began. Lieutenant Sarah Maddox took it all in with a sinking heart. "We're too late," Sergeant Darius Cole muttered. Maddox tightened her grip on her rifle. "Not yet." Behind them, the surviving humans, what was left of Colony Nova's last defenders, followed in a desperate march. Their ragged breathing filled the silence, their weapons trembling in exhausted hands. Among them walked War Chief Sal Zyr, the last uninfected Ulnar leader. His towering reptilian form cut an imposing figure, his emerald eyes scanning the ruined docks with the same grim determination Maddox felt. "The infection was here," he rumbled. "Recently." Maddox knelt beside a fallen soldier, her fingers brushing the wound on his throat. No bite marks. No signs of struggle. Just torn flesh, ripped apart from the inside. She cursed under her breath. They turned mid-evacuation. Cole kicked over the corpse of a technician, revealing the bloated, blackened veins of the infected. "Which means some of them got off this rock before we even knew what was happening." A cold realization settled over them. If the infected had already spread to other ships, there was no telling how far the plague had reached. Maddox straightened. "We need a working vessel. Now." Sal Zyr gestured toward the far end of the hangar. "There." Maddox followed his gaze, and her breath caught. Amid the wreckage, one ship still stood intact. A massive Ulnar dreadnought, its dark hull unmarred by battle. Unlike the smaller, ruined human vessels, this warship had been built to withstand sieges. Its engines still hummed faintly, a promising sign of life amid the destruction. Cole let out a low whistle. "That thing still flies?" Sal Zyr's lip curled. "If it does not, we will make it." Maddox didn't hesitate. "Then that's our way out." They started toward the dreadnought, moving quickly but cautiously. The hangar was too quiet. The infected were here somewhere. Halfway across the docking bay, Maddox's gut twisted. Something was wrong. The silence was. A screech cut through the air. Contact! Cole shouted. From the shadows of the wreckage, they emerged. The infected, hundreds of them. Crawling from ventilation shafts, dropping from overhead beams, pouring out of shattered ships. Human. Ulmer. Mutated beyond recognition. And leading them. A Titan. A creature that had once been a soldier, but now stood nearly 10 feet tall, its body warped by the virus into a grotesque nightmare. Its elongated arms ended in jagged, serrated claws. Its face was barely recognizable, only a sliver of human features remained beneath the pulsing, tumor-like growths. It roared, and the horde charged. Go! Maddox bellowed. They ran. Pulse fire and plasma bolts lit up the hangar as the survivors fought to clear a path. The infected fell in droves, but more kept coming. Maddox fired into the mass, taking down 3, 5, 7, before her rifle clicked empty. She barely had time to reload before the Titan was on them. It lunged, faster than anything that size should have been able to move. Maddox barely ducked as its claws sliced through the air where her head had been. Cole opened fire with his heavy repeater. The rounds slammed into the creature's chest, staggering it but not stopping it. Then, Zhao Ziwire moved. The Ulmer war chief launched himself at the beast with inhuman speed, his plasma sword igniting in a brilliant arc. He slashed, once, twice, his strikes precise and lethal. The infected Titan shrieked as its arm was severed, black ichor sprang across the deck. But it didn't fall. Instead, it turned its soulless, hollow gaze on Zhao Ziwire, and Maddox's blood ran cold. It remembered him. Fall back, she screamed. The survivors sprinted toward the dreadnought's boarding ramp. Zhao Ziwire dodged another swipe, then leapt back, his movements impossibly fast. Cole reached the ship first, slamming his fist against the access panel. Come on, come on. The ramp groaned, beginning its slow descent. The horde was closing in. Maddox spun, her pulse pistol drawn. Zhao Ziwire. Move! The Ulmer war chief didn't hesitate. He turned and sprinted. The infected Titan roared in frustration, clawing at empty air as its prey escaped. Maddox and Zhao Ziwire dove onto the ramp just as it lifted off the ground. The ship's interior sealed shut with a heavy clang. They had made it. For now. Gasping for breath, Maddox pulled herself up and took in their surroundings. The dreadnought's dark halls were eerily silent. The survivors gathered, wide-eyed, shaken. Cole exhaled. All right. We're alive. Now what? Maddox turned to Zhao Ziwire. You're the expert. Can this thing get us out of here? The Ulmer placed a clawed hand against the nearest console. Lights flickered to life as the ship's dormant systems stirred. A deep hum rumbled through the deck. Yes, Zhao Ziwire said. But we are not safe yet. Maddox didn't like the way he said that. Why? She asked warily. Zhao Ziwire's emerald eyes darkened. Because the infection is already here. The moment those words left War Chief Zhao Ziwire's mouth, the survivors tensed. A heavy silence filled the Ulmer dreadnought's command deck, broken only by the soft hum of the ship's awakening systems. Lieutenant Sarah Maddox's pulse pounded in her ears. What do you mean, it's already here? Zhao Ziwire's emerald gaze swept over the survivors, his clawed hand resting on his plasma blade. I can smell it. Maddox exchanged a look with Sergeant Darius Cole. His grip tightened around his rifle. No one showed signs of infection before we boarded, Cole argued. Zhao Ziwire let out a low growl. The infection does not always reveal itself immediately. His reptilian eyes narrowed. Sometimes it waits. A deep unease settled over the group. They had fought to escape the colony, barely surviving the horrors they had left behind. The idea that they had brought it with them, that one of them might be turning. It was almost too much to process. Almost. Maddox shook off the creeping dread and switched to survival mode. All right, listen up. Until we confirm who, if someone is infected, we don't turn on each other. Understood? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the survivors, but fear was already setting in. Cole turned toward the ship's darkened corridors. How big is this thing? Zalzywir's expression hardened. This is a Galzorath-class dreadnought. It was designed for planetary sieges. He gestured toward the towering blast doors leading deeper inside. There are over 50 decks. Maddox grimaced. 50 decks. If the infection was loose on the ship, they'd never find it in time. Then again, maybe they wouldn't have to. The bridge, she said. If we can get there, we can lock down the rest of the ship. Contain whatever's in here before it spreads. Zalzywir gave a sharp nod. Agreed. Cole checked his ammo. Then let's move. The survivors formed up and moved as one, heading deeper into the dreadnought's shadowed corridors. The air inside was cold, sterile, and too quiet. This ship was supposed to be carrying the last remnants of the Ulmer Dominion, but there were no signs of the crew. No bodies. No blood. Just empty halls and abandoned stations. It was as if the ship had been waiting for them. A chill ran down Maddox's spine. Something wasn't right. They had made it halfway to the bridge when the first scream tore through the halls. Back! Get back! The group spun, weapons raised. A young technician, Vasquez, stumbled forward from the rear of the formation. His face was twisted in agony, his veins bulging black beneath his skin. His eyes, once clear, were now black pits of hunger. He lurched forward, his body convulsing as something shifted beneath his skin. His arms spasmed, his fingers elongating, cracking as they turned into claw-like appendages. Cole didn't hesitate. One clean shot to the head. Vasquez dropped. Silence. The survivors stared in horror. Maddox forced herself to stay focused. No bites. No wounds. She turned to Zalzywir. You were right. It's already inside us. Cole exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. If he turned that fast, how many more are infected without knowing? Maddox surveyed the survivors. No one looked sick. No one seemed off. But neither had Vasquez until seconds before he turned. The horror of it settled over them all. This ship has med bay facilities, correct? Maddox asked Zalzywir. He nodded. Yes. Medical scanners. Containment units. Maddox made a call. Then before we go to the bridge, we scan everyone. Cole didn't argue. Neither did the others. Fear had taken hold, and now no one trusted anyone else. The trek to the medical bay was quiet, too quiet. The dreadnought was starting to feel like a tomb. They reached the med bay doors and forced them open. The interior was cold and lifeless, but the scanners still worked. One by one, they stepped into the machines. The first few scans came up clean. Then, a deep alarm blared. The screen flashed red. Maddox turned, just in time to see one of the engineers, Larson, drop to his knees, clutching his head. He screamed, veins blackening instantly. Maddox raised her weapon. It was too late. Larson convulsed violently, his spine snapping backward, his mouth stretching unnaturally wide. His fingers split into jagged, clawed tendrils. Then, his entire chest ripped open, and something else emerged. Not human. Not Ulmer. Something new. A perfected version of the infection. A hunter. Maddox barely had time to register the horror before the creature moved. Faster than anything they had seen before. Cole fired. Zalzywir slashed with his plasma blade. But the thing was already among them, carving through the survivors like a blade through paper. Screams filled the med bay. Blood splattered across the sterile walls. Maddox grabbed a rifle from one of the fallen and emptied the clip into the monster's skull. The rounds barely slowed it down. We're losing people. Cole roared. Fall back. Maddox shouted. To the bridge. The survivors turned and ran. Behind them, the hunter shrieked, its body twisting and evolving even further. This wasn't just an infection anymore. It was intelligent. And it wasn't going to let them leave. The corridors of the Ulmer dreadnought echoed with screams. Lieutenant Sarah Maddox sprinted through the dimly lit halls, pulse pounding, rifle clutched in a death grip. Behind her, the survivors ran for their lives, Cole, Zal Zyr, and the dwindling remnants of their group. And behind them, the hunter followed. It wasn't like the other infected. It didn't stumble blindly, didn't attack mindlessly. It was aware. It stalked them through the ship like a predator, moving faster than anything that size should have been able to. Maddox stole a glance over her shoulder. The thing had once been a man, an engineer named Larson, but now it was something else entirely. Its elongated limbs were a blur as it ran, its grotesque, open chest pulsing with unnatural energy. Its blackened eyes gleamed with intelligence, hunger, malice. It was playing with them. We need to lose it. Cole shouted, breath ragged. We can't outrun it, Maddox snapped back. We need to trap it. Zal Zyr, running beside her, gave a sharp nod. There's a security checkpoint ahead, blast doors can be sealed manually. That was good enough. Maddox pivoted. You heard him. We lure it in and cut it off. They bolted down a side corridor, heading for the checkpoint. The dreadnought's architecture was unfamiliar, its dark, sloping walls lined with glowing Ulmer runes. The emergency lights flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows that made everything feel even more wrong. The checkpoint came into view, an intersection of 4 corridors, marked by massive blast doors that could be locked down in an emergency. It was their best chance. Cole slid to a stop, raising his rifle. We bait it in, then close the doors behind it. Maddox nodded. We trap it inside. Then we figure out how to kill it. The survivors pressed against the walls, taking cover behind crates and debris. Then, silence. No screeches. No pounding footsteps. Maddox frowned. Where is it? Zal Zyr's emerald eyes narrowed. It knows. A chill ran through Maddox. The hunter was watching them. Studying them. Then, the lights died. The corridor plunged into blackness. Someone cursed. A terrified whisper. It's toying with us. Maddox clenched her jaw. Everyone stay. A scream. Gunfire erupted as something slammed into the group. Maddox's night vision kicked in just in time to see one of the survivors, a young woman named Patel, yanked into the darkness. Her body twisted violently, her bones snapping. Then she was gone. Maddox opened fire. Light it up. Cole and the others unleashed everything they had. Pulse rounds, plasma bolts, even a grenade. The corridor lit up with muzzle flashes, but the hunter moved too fast. It was a blur, weaving between shots, darting along the walls and sealing like an insect. Then, it lunged. It slammed into one of the soldiers, its claws tearing through his armor like it was paper. The man barely had time to scream before his body ruptured, his chest splitting open, veins blackening instantly. The hunter wasn't just killing them. It was spreading the infection. Close the doors! Maddox shouted. Zal Zyr slammed a clawed hand onto the control panel. The blast doors groaned to life. The hunter realized what was happening too late. The massive steel barriers slammed shut, cutting it off from them. Silence. Maddox's breath came in ragged gasps. They had trapped it. For now. Cole wiped blood off his face, looking around at what was left of their group. 7 survivors. That was it. 7 out of the 30 that had made it onto the ship. It wasn't enough. Maddox turned to Zal Zyr. That thing is faster than anything I've ever seen. Stronger. Smarter. Zal Zyr's expression was grim. It is an evolution of the infection. Not just a mutation, an adaptation. Maddox exhaled. That meant they weren't just dealing with mindless husks anymore. The infection was learning. Improving. Can we kill it? Cole asked. Zalziwire's claws flexed. Perhaps. Maddox wasn't convinced. But right now, they had a bigger problem. The bridge, she said. We need to get there before more of us turn. Zalziwire gave a sharp nod. This way. They started moving again, pushing deeper into the dreadnought. The walls seemed tighter now, the darkness heavier. The ship felt different. Like it knew. Like it was watching. Maddox kept her rifle close, scanning every shadow. The hunter might have been trapped, but there was no telling what else was on board. As they moved through the ship's twisting corridors, an uneasy thought settled in her mind. The hunter had been too fast. Too aware. What if it hadn't just evolved? What if it had always been here? They reached the final passage leading to the bridge, a massive door, sealed shut. Zalziwire moved toward the control panel. Then, a soft sound. A whisper. Maddox froze. Her blood ran cold. It came from the comms panel. The ship's intercom crackled to life, a voice slithering through the static. A voice that shouldn't exist. A voice that had once belonged to Larson, the man who had become the hunter. It was laughing. You think I'm trapped? The voice rasped. Then, the lights flickered. The sealed blast doors hissed open on their own. And from the darkness beyond, the hunter stepped through. Maddox barely had time to raise her weapon before it vanished into the shadows again. It was no longer hunting them. It was hurting them. The hunter was loose again. Lieutenant Sarah Maddox barely had time to process it before the emergency lights flickered violently, plunging the corridor into alternating moments of darkness and blood-red illumination. The effect was disorienting, making every shadow stretch and twist like the infected were already among them. Move, she shouted, pulling the survivors toward the bridge. Zalziwire slammed his clawed hand onto the access panel. The bridge doors hissed open, revealing a vast, circular command center lined with alien consoles. A towering viewport stretched across the front, showing the endless void of space, and, in the distance, the haunting silhouette of the alien Armada, still motionless in orbit. Get inside. Cole barked, shoving the remaining survivors forward. Maddox was the last one through, spinning just in time to catch a blur of movement in the corridor. The hunter wasn't chasing them anymore. It was waiting. Observing. She didn't hesitate. She slammed the emergency override, sealing the bridge doors with a deep, echoing clang. Silence. The survivors staggered forward, catching their breath. 7 remained: Maddox, Cole, Zalziwire, and 4 others. All battered, bloodied, and terrified. Cole wiped sweat from his brow. That thing should have been stuck behind those blast doors. How the hell did it get out? Zalziwire's emerald eyes darkened. It is learning. Maddox didn't like the way he said that. She turned to the consoles. We need to take control of the ship and get out of here. Zalziwire moved swiftly, his claws dancing over the Ulmer controls. The massive ship rumbled as its systems powered up. A deep hum filled the air as the weapons came online. For the first time since they boarded, Maddox felt a sliver of hope. Then, the ship spoke. A voice, synthetic but warped, alien, yet almost human, whispered through the bridge speakers. You shouldn't have come here. Maddox froze. It wasn't the hunter's voice. It wasn't a distress beacon or a leftover transmission. It was the ship itself. Zalziwire's claws twitched. Impossible. The dreadnought's AI should be dormant. Maybe it was, Maddox murmured. But it isn't anymore. Cole took a cautious step forward. Are you saying this whole damn ship is, what? Infected? The lights dimmed. The floor beneath them shuddered. Then, the consoles began changing. Not malfunctioning, morphing. The sleek ulnar technology rippled, tendrils of black organic matter crawling across the walls, slithering into the circuitry like veins feeding into a heart. Back away. Maddox snapped. The ship was alive. And it was changing, just like the Hunter. Cole's face went pale. We're standing inside a giant version of that thing, aren't we? Before Maddox could answer, a low, wet sound echoed through the bridge. Dripping. Stretching. Growing. Her stomach dropped. She followed the sound to the far end of the room, where something was forming near the ceiling. A cocoon. Massive. Pulsing. Alive. And inside it, something moved. Zalzyr took a step forward, his voice a growl. The hive is awakening. A choke sob came from one of the survivors. What does that mean? Before anyone could answer, the cocoon split open. A new creature dropped to the floor in a wet, sickening heap. It was twice the size of the Hunter. A mass of writhing, bone-like limbs and partially formed faces, not just human, but Ulmer, twisted together into one monstrous entity. Then, it spoke. Not in a whisper, not in an echoing rasp. It spoke in many voices, a chorus of the dead. This ship is not yours. Maddox felt her breath catch. Cole raised his rifle. What the hell is that? Zalzywir's expression was grim. The apex. Maddox didn't hesitate. Open fire. Gunfire tore through the bridge. Pulse rounds, plasma bolts, everything they had. The apex lurched forward, taking the hits but barely reacting. Its limbs moved with unnatural fluidity, its grotesque faces screaming in unison. Then, it countered. Tendrils lashed out, slamming into the survivors like a wrecking ball. One man was lifted off the ground, his body absorbed instantly into the creature's flesh. Maddox barely had time to react before it came for her. She rolled, dodging a clawed appendage that would have eviscerated her. Cole wasn't as lucky, he took a glancing hit, his armor barely holding as he was thrown across the bridge. Zalzyr. Maddox shouted. Tell me we can still fly this thing. Zalzyr was already moving, his claws flying across the controls. If we do not leave now, we will never leave at all. The apex roared, the sound making the very walls tremble. The survivors regrouped, their weapons barely making a difference. Maddox could see it now, the hive wasn't just one entity anymore. It was the ship. It was everything. And it wasn't letting them leave. Then, a desperate idea hit her. Zalzyr, she called. What's the fastest way to wipe out an infestation on a ship? The Ulnar war chief understood immediately. His expression hardened. A full core purge, he said. But it will destroy the ship. Maddox's grip tightened on her rifle. They weren't escaping. They were ending this. Cole, still coughing from the hit he took, managed a weak grin. If we're going out, might as well take the bastards with us. Maddox nodded. Then let's light this thing up. Zalzywir's claws moved with purpose. The ship's AI screeched in protest, but he overrode it. The countdown began. 5 minutes to core detonation. The hive felt it. The apex screamed in fury. The ship shook violently, like a dying beast. Maddox turned to the survivors. Time to run. The countdown ticked down. 4 minutes, 30 seconds. The Ulnar dreadnought shuddered violently, its very structure protesting the overload. The ship's core was destabilizing, its energy feeds rerouted into a catastrophic chain reaction that would soon turn the entire vessel into a burning tomb. Maddox, Cole, Zalzyr, and the last surviving soldiers sprinted through the twisting corridors, heading for the escape shuttle dock. Behind them, the hive raged. The apex, the grotesque fusion of the infected, let out a howl of fury that rippled through the ship's intercom. The once sleek metal walls warped as veins of black, organic matter pulsed like a dying heart. The ship was no longer just alive, it was desperate. It did not want to die alone. Tendrils erupted from the walls, lashing toward the fleeing humans. One nearly impaled Cole, but he rolled aside, pulse rifle blazing as he severed the monstrous limb. The creature shrieked in pain, its cry echoing down the corridors. Maddox didn't look back. She didn't need to. The hunter was coming. A blur of unnatural speed. A predator's patience, now replaced with rage. Faster. Maddox shouted. 3 minutes, 45 seconds. The escape dock came into view, a reinforced bay at the end of the corridor. The shuttle sat waiting, its engines cold, its systems still locked in standby. Zal Zyr rushed to the controls. His claws flew across the panel, trying to power up the ship. Cole covered the entrance, rifle raised. Come on, come on. Then, the hunter attacked. It hit like a hurricane, moving faster than any of them could react. It tore into the closest soldier, lifting him with inhuman strength before hurling his body into a bulkhead with a sickening crunch. Maddox fired, pulse rounds tearing into its flesh, but it didn't slow down. The hunter lunged. Maddox barely dodged, the creature's claws grazing her armor. A fraction slower, and she would have been cut in half. Cole took the shot, a full-powered blast to the head. The hunter staggered, snarling, its skull half exploded, but still alive. It was dying, but it wasn't done. It grabbed Cole. No! Maddox lunged, but too late. The hunter drove its claws into his chest. Cole gritted his teeth, eyes wide in agony. He had seconds left. Maddox's breath caught. He turned to her. And he smiled. Go! Then, Cole grabbed a grenade from his belt. He yanked the pin, and shoved it into the hunter's open chest. The explosion ripped through the corridor. Maddox barely had time to dive away as the hunter was obliterated, its body reduced to twisted, burning flesh. Cole was gone. Maddox forced herself forward. 2 minutes, 15 seconds. Zal Zyr shouted, "Shuttle is ready." Maddox and the last 2 survivors jumped aboard. The doors sealed behind them. Zal Zyr slammed the thrusters to full burn. The shuttle roared to life, metal straining as it shot out of the docking bay. Maddox rushed to the viewport, just in time to see the hive's final stand. The apex had reached the hangar. Its massive, grotesque form rippled as it screamed in fury, tendrils lashing out toward the escaping shuttle. The Ulmer dreadnought lurched, its power core seconds from rupture. Then, it detonated. The explosion was blinding. A shockwave of blue-white energy erupted outward, shattering the dreadnought from within. The hive's monstrous form was consumed instantly, its unearthly scream cut short. The infected Ulmer ship tore apart, fragments scattering into the void. Maddox exhaled, chest heaving. It was over. The hive was gone. Zal Zyr's claws flexed. We survived. Maddox barely heard him. Her gaze was locked onto the viewport, onto the Ulmer Armada, still motionless in the distance. And then, the ships moved. One by one, the massive warships shifted course. Not toward them. Toward Earth. Maddox felt her stomach drop. They weren't waiting for the hive to be destroyed, she whispered. Cole had sacrificed himself. They had killed the infection. But it didn't matter. The Ulmer never came to stop the infection. They came to exterminate humanity. Zal Zyr's voice was grim. They are still at war with your kind. Maddox's hands clenched into fists. It wasn't over. Not even close. They had survived the hive. Now, they had to survive the Ulmer War. And this time, there would be no escape.